So a week ago, I got to see Dune Part 2, and I thought to myself, finally, 2024 has moved on to the point of the year where we're actually going to start getting good movies. No more of these bad, stinky, garbage films. And then this week, I got to see Imaginary. And it seems like Dune Part 2 might have just been an anomaly. So Imaginary, it's a brand new horror film by Blumhouse Productions. It's directed by Jeff Wardlow, who has made incredible masterpieces like Truth or Dare. Imaginary is this brand new horror movie about this girl who has an imaginary friend, and the imaginary friend is essentially this spirit ghost thing that is haunting this family. It's a simple enough setup, simple enough premise. It's kind of crazy. This is the first of 2 movies we're getting this year about imaginary friends. The other one is very, very different, with John Krasinski directing. That one, I assume, is going to be a little bit better than this one. But this one is a horror film around this idea, and on paper, I actually thought this sounded kind of cool. I also really liked the trailer. You know, the trailer that's been playing for months at every single movie theater? It was just my imagination. I'm sorry. I'd seen that trailer 100 times, and I honestly thought this kind of looked like it had some promise. Now, Blumhouse, you gotta understand something about Blumhouse. They make a lot of horror movies, and their horror movies are very safe. They don't take many big risks, they don't take many big swings. They make very standard horror movies that will do the bare minimum, but also usually end up being very, very entertaining, and sometimes contain some good scares. Every now and then they'll have a major hit, sometimes at the very, very worst they'll just have standard horror films, and all of them typically do well at the box office. I understand the business model, I understand what they do, and they do a very good job at what they do. They just don't really make those big, kind of experimental horror films, which is what I like in this genre, because this genre for me has become so oversaturated. We get so many movies that are way too similar to each other. I like when they try something new with horror movies, that really, really try to dig into the psyche of the audience to scare them. This movie doesn't do that. It is as standard a horror movie as you can expect, and it actually is a lot worse than most standard horror movies. Now, let me kind of explain. First off, this film commits one of the main cardinal sins of horror movies. It's boring. It's very, very boring. Now, with bad horror movies, which we get a lot of them, something like earlier this year, like the Night Swim movie. That movie is really, really bad, but at the very, very least, it's so bad that it's almost hilarious. It's so much fun to watch because it's terrible, right? It's goofy, it's dumb. This movie is just a slog. It is goofy at times, and there are moments that made me laugh hysterically, but a lot of this movie, especially in the setup early on in the film, is just, it's hard to get through because it drags so long, and nothing really happens for the longest time, and when you get these scare sequences, they're really not scary at all, which is the second cardinal sin I'll get into in a second. There was one scene early on where the main character is peeking over a bed and there's a moment of silence. That scare kind of worked, but many of the horror moments in this film and the scares just don't work at all, and the setup to get into what's actually going on with this imaginary friend, it's just very boring, and everything around it just feels as generic and as standard as it gets. There's nothing in the cinematography and the visuals and the art style, literally nothing going on here on a technical aspect that sets this movie apart from any other horror movie that you're ever going to see, which just made it very, very boring. Also, I just want to leave a note before I forget about it. It might have been my movie theater, so maybe I'm wrong on this, but I thought the lighting in the movie, it was very dark. It kind of felt like I was watching, the last season of Game of Thrones. Everything was just so dark. Yet again, it might have just been my movie theater, so, if that's what it is, I apologize for shitting on the lighting in this movie. But yeah, we'll get to cardinal sin number 2, and that's the scares. This movie's not scary. It's just not. I mean, maybe it's scary for, a target audience of, 12, 13-year-olds, and if it does scare them, then great, you guys did your job, Blumhouse. You made a movie for a younger audience, and that's fine. But for me, I just did not think this movie was scary at the slightest. The scares in this movie are mostly just jump scares, the standard goofy stuff of, you see stuff moving around in the background, and the whole audience goes, oh my god, there's something, it's just the goofy, generic scares that you've seen a million times in movies, and it just, for me, it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't. You need to go a little bit above and beyond with the scares, not just in the visual cues, the practical scares of the jump scares and the setups to the jump scares. That's not just what I'm talking about, but there's also a psychological element that needs to be built within the story to really scare. For example, a movie like Hereditary, and I know it's kind of poor to, compare this to Hereditary, one of the best horror movies ever, but a movie like that has jump scares. It has moments like that, especially in the third act. But those scares are not just scary because they're jump scares and because they have a good setup. it's because of the entire package of the movie setting up this psychological element of dread and suspense around the world, around these characters, that makes those moments so much more terrifying because you've been anticipating them for so long, and you only have like a base understanding of what's really going on. You're still left in the dark a little bit, and it makes those moments so terrifying. This movie lacks that. It lacks any sense of a psychological horror, and then it really tries to explain the actual, like, what's going on. It has that stupid, I hate it when horror movies do this, that stereotypical horror movie moment where we go and we get like a 5-minute expository dialogue monologue, right? Just 5 minutes of them explaining what's been going on, what the horror is, what the scare is, and I hate that. Anytime you have to do that in a movie, you have to explain to the audience what's been going on. To me, it just ruins the whole point of the movie. Either the audience should organically figure out the scare, the horror on their own, or they shouldn't figure it out. The not knowing part, the mystery, the feeling like the world is against them, that all of this crazy stuff is going on and there is no logical explanation, that to me is what makes a movie terrifying. For example, yet again, another movie we just got recently, Talk to Me, which was a directorial debut from people who had never made a major movie like this before. That movie handled its horror in the most perfect way. It set up this hand that allows people to talk to ghosts and see spirits, and it never explains it. It really just tells the audience the practical sense of what this item is and what the scares are. It doesn't go into the actual explanation of what each thing is and how it works and what's going on, because the mystery of it all is what is scary, and the revelation at the end of the movie, as you just see the characters experiencing certain things, is very terrifying, and that to me is what makes a horror movie scary. And this movie just explains the entire thing, and it wasn't scary before, and it certainly wasn't scary after. It was kind of goofy. And then the movie in its third act sort of becomes a remake of Insidious, but it's nowhere near as good as Insidious because it just doesn't have that same flair that James Wan has with his horror movies. James Wan has really kind of revolutionized and made popular this style of horror movie. Let's just be real here. Most of these horror movies we get today are following a structure and a standard that James Wan kind of set out with the Insidious films, which of course he was following standards from other horror movies, of course, but he kind of built this perfect standard and this perfect structure that everybody's been following. This movie follows that as well, and it definitely feels so similar to Insidious, which is weird because its actual concept is very different from Insidious. It's very, very different from Insidious, but they decided to go with set pieces in that third act and sort of imagery and ideas that felt like they were ripped from an Insidious movie, and I just didn't understand that because this movie has an original concept. It has original ideas that really could work for a horror movie, both in a practical visual sense, but also in a thematical sense. I think there was really interesting ideas and a very interesting story that could have been told here, but for some reason it just all felt watered down, and it felt like it was ripping off some other movie that has nothing to do with this one, and because of that, the film just felt like nothing. There's also a moment in the third act where this film kind of does this horror trope. I'm not going to spoil anything, but it does something that happens in a lot of horror movies. This trope in this horror movie that happens right at the end of the third act where you're like, oh my god, wow. And it does it in this movie, and it doesn't do it well, because in the third act of this movie, you're getting ready for the credits to roll. You feel like the credits are about to roll, and this movie dragged on to this point, so you're getting ready for it to end. And then it doesn't end. It sort of rewinds back into like the middle of the third act, and you have to go through this whole thing over again. And that was rough. That was really rough, man. Oh, by the way, Jesus is in this movie. Yeah, Jesus. Remember from The Walking Dead? Yeah, he's in the movie. Wow, I don't want to shit on Jesus, but I'll say the chemistry between the romance in this movie, the husband and wife, it's something. It's something to be seen. It's wow. I do love me some Jesus, though. Love Jesus. But overall, I was very disappointed in Imaginary. I actually had high hopes of this movie. I thought it could be something original. I think maybe a sequel could be cool, and they probably will make a sequel. I mean, my theater was packed. My assumption is this movie's probably going to make a decent amount of money, and it was probably made on a small budget. So I can imagine it's going to get a sequel, as does pretty much every Blumhouse movie that does well, and maybe in the sequel they can kind of capitalize on some of the cool ideas and themes of this concept and make something better. But yet again, like I said with Blumhouse, they really make kind of the standardized horror films, which a lot of the times works. I said last year with Five Nights at Freddy's, a movie I didn't love, but I thought that movie was good for what it needed to be. It was a standard adaptation of Five Nights at Freddy's. It made a lot of the fans of that series very happy. It made a lot of money. How can I sit here and say they did a shit job with that? They didn't. They made a standard movie for very cheap, made a lot of money. This movie, if it makes a lot of money, then great. They made a standard movie that appeased like some audiences, and it made a good amount of money. That might be what it is. But for me, somebody who watches a lot of movies and a lot of TV and a lot of content, and I review it all here, I gotta tell the truth. I just didn't like it. I didn't enjoy the movie. I'm just gonna be honest with you. But we'll see how the sequel is. Imaginary 2, hopefully it doesn't happen, if I'm gonna be honest. Hopefully it never, ever happens. I can't do this. I can't watch these movies anymore, guys. I can't do it. I will give Imaginary a 1.5 out of 5. I just cannot recommend watching it unless you're like 13. Then maybe you'll like it. That's the video, guys. Thank you for watching. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe for more. Click the video on your screen right now to see more, and I will see you in the next one.